Bonjour.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for being here for this session entitled Restoring Industrial Sovereignty. So this is a question that comes back again and again, but today the context is new. And that's because there are environmental constraints that are imposing changes in our prediction modes, in our consumption modes. There is the climate emergency, which requires fast decisions, and the international order from the Second World War is obsolete. And we are seeing a new organization. So restoring industrial sovereignty means that we first have to recognize the ability of the state to define and implement an industrial policy so that independence with respect to the rest of the world doesn't endanger the rest of our society. This industrial policy does not consist in helping companies with disparate actions. It consists in defining a strategy and the best vectors for transmission for implementing it. This also means that it's important to recognize the legitimacy of the state, its ability to draw up an industrial policy, in other words, recognizing the necessity to regulate markets. So this point reflects a general feeling. It was today, but it wasn't the case yesterday, especially when it came to our trade partners. Now, this legitimacy, and I'd like to underline this, I think it's very important. This legitimacy also means that the state needs to assess the results of its policies. It needs to assess the use of public money. Now, this public money, has it allowed us to achieve the objectives? Have actions been carried out in an efficient manner? Do we need to keep the same actions, the same transmission vectors, or must we modify them? This industrial policy, is it directly for companies? What about other transmission vectors? I think that this assessment, this evaluation of public money and industrial policy is absolutely essential. And in France, we have plenty of expertise in this field. Finally, when we're talking about industrial policy, we think about industrial sovereignty. But complete autonomy is neither possible nor desirable. And it's inevitable that we need to define cooperation strategies. Now, this strategies and this sovereignty, it needs to focus on Europe. The scope needs to be European, and we also need to think about cultural proximity and a community of interests leading to allegiance to powers. This strategy must also take into account new realities of emerging countries and developing countries that have changed a lot. And we need to integrate them into our policies so that we can adapt our production policies to environmental changes. Now, all of these questions will be explored during the conference by the people here on the stage. There will be 2 people following us remotely. And so that we don't waste any time, because we have very little time, I'm going to give the microphone straight away to Patrice MOROT. He's president of PwC France and the Maghreb. So you have the floor. Thank you very much. First of all, I think you underlined it already, the COVID crisis, the war in Ukraine, unfortunately, and many other events have shed light on the need for sovereignty and supply safety. We carried out a study that was published in May 2022, so not very long ago. And in the study, we analyzed the different trajectories, the different paths in 2030. And what we saw was that restoring our industrial sovereignty came across different problems, rather a number of contradictions. First of all, it involves massive investment. This has to be recognized. 100 billion, 30 billion. Out of the 130, there are 30 billion for productive investments, and that's quite considerable. But in spite of that, when we looked at our models, we studied our scenarios, we realized that that investment would allow us to go from 10%, so that's the weight of industry in our GDP would go from 10% to 12% and 16%. So it's very important, but it's not enough. It's substantial, but not enough. And you know, that's a reflection of our history. You know, we've neglected industry. The second contradiction is the triptych. We don't talk enough about land and what is lacking in terms of land. And to restore industrial sovereignty, well, we'll have to build factories, but we have to have land to build factories on. We know that it will take a lot of time. It will take 4 to 5 years to qualify land as something that can be used. And then you have the resilience, the resilient climate, the climate resilience law that limits a certain number of things. And then we have training, skills. There are 70,000 jobs to be filled in industry, and to satisfy these challenges and this ambition, we need to train an awful lot of people because we don't have enough expertise, we don't have enough skills, and we won't have them between now and 2030. And then you've got the availability of financing to be taken into account today. As well, the 30 billion, we need 70 billion from private investment in order to reach the 12% and create 430,000 jobs. And so we need financing for all of that. And then finally, the last contradiction, the last thing that's important is social acceptability. What does that mean, social acceptability? It means that today, unfortunately, industry in our country sometimes has a negative image. Our country doesn't realize how it's evolved. We've moved up to 4.0, Industry 4.0. So why is that contradictory? Well, everybody agrees that it's important that we have more industry, that we need to restore our industrial sovereignty. But at the same time, do we agree to reopen mines of rare earths? Because we know that we're going to be needing those rare earths. Do we all agree that at the end of the street, and I'm caricaturing rather, we need chemical industries, chemical factories that open? So I think, we've got all of these contradictions. We have to make societal choices that are important. And I think probably we need to talk about them more, because these choices concern absolutely everybody. I think that it's extremely important for us to restore our industrial sovereignty, and perhaps we'll talk about a number of proposals and solutions during the debate. Thank you very much for keeping to the timing there. So I'm now going to hand the microphone over to Mr. Tidjane THIAM, who should be with us normally. Yes, I am here. Yes, hello. We can hear you very well, Mr. THIAM. You're Executive President of the Freedom Acquisition Corporation, and you have the floor. Thank you very much. I hope that everybody will be able to follow what I'm going to say, and I'm sorry that I'm not in X with you. So I would like to talk about the context that we have. There's the structural aspect of globalization. There are the negative aspects. But then we have the economic climate and the COVID crisis. There's the war in the Ukraine. I'd just like to spend 2 or 3 minutes on the question of the supply chain, because it's important. So before COVID, we were focused on efficiency, and we were focused on resilience. So that in the 90s, we focused on efficiency, and in 2000s, we had another model. I'm sorry, but the sound keeps cutting off.
The origin of the products which came from all over the world, well, you know, we actually enjoyed low cost. They supply complex supply chains. The major impact before the COVID crisis. What happened is that after that, we're sorry, but the quality of the transmission does not allow for translation. Very sorry, sir. Even though the model allows for having low costs, but there are also high. Well, we've seen, for example, in the automobile industry, for example, there is the. No, sorry, I'm sorry. We're doing our best, but we cannot hear the speaker. Very sorry.
Si vous prenez les 3000 premières entreprises mondiales, leurs stocks sont passés de 6% du PIB mondial à environ 9%. C'est énorme, c'est une augmentation de 50% des stocks pour se prémunir contre les pénuries et l'inflation. Donc on a à peu près 9 000 milliards de dollars aujourd'hui de stocks accumulés dans l'économie mondiale. Alors moi ce que je voulais dire là-dessus, c'est simplement que cette transition d'une extrême efficience vers de sécurité et de résilience est nécessaire, mais elle doit se faire avec raison, avec modération et avec discernement. Et pour moi, le pire serait qu'on aboutisse à un cocktail de protectionnisme et de subvention dont tout le monde pâtirait. Parce qu'à terme, et ça on oublie toujours, tout ce système de dire qui paye, à terme c'est le consommateur qui paie à travers des prix plus élevés. Et ça risque de poser des problèmes. On a bien vu la sensibilité du consommateur à l'inflation. Et par ailleurs, ça va vraiment dans le mauvais sens. On a aujourd'hui 25 millions de tonnes de céréales qui sont prises en Ukraine et la plupart des pays sont en train de prendre des mesures qui, au lieu d'atténuer le problème, nous rendent encore plus aigus. L'Inde vient d'annoncer qu'elle bloque les exportations de blé. Il y a un certain nombre de pays qui actuellement limitent l'exportation des engrais. Ce dont on a besoin, c'est plus de production agricole, pas moins de production. On sait qu'il y a une très forte élasticité des prix des productions agricoles. Il ne faut pas bloquer les prix des produits, parce que cela découragerait la production et va rendre les problèmes encore plus aigus. Donc je crois qu'il faut faire très attention dans ce contexte à des solutions qui sont des solutions qui paraissent être de bon sens, mais qui risquent à terme de se retourner contre même les catégories qu'on peut protéger. Donc il faut que les décideurs, les chefs d'entreprise se montrent raisonnables et qu'on puisse sortir par le haut à ce contexte avec une économie qui puisse garder certains des avantages.
Excusez-moi,
en devenant plus résiliente. Et je veux juste faire un commentaire parce que je pense qu'on ne se demande pas assez pourquoi on a pu avoir pendant si longtemps des taux d'intérêt bas et peu d'inflation. Et ça se mesure, il y a eu une déflation mondiale induite par la Chine. Là, on voit que quand la Chine arrive en fin de course des gains de productivité qu'elle peut fournir à l'économie mondiale, soudain, l'inflation revient. C'est tout facteur. Mais la Chine a contribué à une élévation de l'économie globale et à une élévation du pouvoir d'achat à travers cette déflation par les coûts. Donc finalement, juste pour conclure, parce qu'on a un temps limité, mais je voudrais juste finir en disant que pour moi, la vraie souveraineté, c'est celle des idées. Que la souveraineté, elle découle de la capacité à produire des biens et des services que le reste du monde désire. Et ça, c'est incontournable. Et que donc, la souveraineté, un pays n'a autant de souveraineté qu'il a de capacité d'innover et de créer. Pendant longtemps, on a dit que la Chine savait produire, mais pas innover. On voit aujourd'hui avec Alibaba qui est partout, encore TikTok, quelle que soit la valeur qu'on attribue à tout ça, qu'elle est absolument capable d'innover. Et donc, je crois, et pour finir, que si la France veut recouvrer la souveraineté industrielle, elle doit le faire en innovant avant tout, peut-être aussi en légiférant, mais pas en interdisant, et en innovant et en investissant dans la créativité. Voilà.
Merci beaucoup. Je vous redonne...
Thank you very much. I'll give you the microphone later on, but if possible, can I ask you to stay at the same distance from your microphone because you keep cutting off. I'm now going to hand over to Mr. Cyril GARCIA, who is the director of Capgemini Invent. Yes, hello, can everybody hear me? Perfect. So that's a superb subject. It's been the subject of many publications, price studies, a very interesting book by Nicolas Dufour published a few weeks ago. So the role of states, it's the battle of intelligent industry. That's the core subject. That's the battle that has to be won in the 5 coming years. And there are 2 objectives. The first is sovereignty, and sovereignty is a content creating jobs on national territories and elsewhere. And the second dimension is strategies. It's based on strategies, being compliant and following strategies, low carbon, whether they're national or European strategies. So those are the two main objects, sovereignties and low carbon. And there are three fronts. The first is the smart industry front. We need intelligent, smart technologies. The second front is circularity. That's vital for all of us. And the third front is a word that's coming back into fashion, and that is planning. So nobody's telling me to stop, so I'll continue. So in terms of smart industry, we've got platforms, we've got 3D platforms, digital platforms, we've got digital twins to optimize the use of natural resources and preserve our land. We know the impact of our production, so we can anticipate, we can think ahead and improve the situation. So that's one aspect of intelligence. The other aspect that is coming to the fore is that we have to think about the end of product life cycles. We need to go beyond the triptych extract, produce, use, throw away. So there are several stakeholders across the world involved in that. We need to think about sustainable products, products that last. This has been a wish for a long time, but now it's becoming an operational and technological possibility. And behind that, you've got the second front, and that is the front that involves circularity. So this is an essential response, an essential solution when it comes to the sovereignty debate. It allows us not only to control our resources. Patrice was talking about the question of land. But, you know, we're not just going to look for new land. We're going to use existing land. So we need to control our resources. We need to master them. And we need to reduce our dependency. It's all well and good. You know, we'll talk about industry of the future, solar panels, solar farms, battery gigafactories, catalyzers, methane producers. All of that is fueled by cobalt, lithium, nickel, copper, which are rare materials, and they're vital components for our industrial future and for our jobs of the future. And if I may, I declare that the circular economy is an emergency. It's right at the heart of all of these industrial challenges. And we haven't got 20 years ahead of us. It's only we've got 5 years ahead of us. And then let's talk about planning. We can talk about clean tech. We need to make sure that our industries and economies become greener, hopefully before 2050. We know we've identified things. There are many studies on the 50, 60 technologies classified per industry, per field of innovation. There are gigafactories, carbon capture, smart grids. They all have an impact in terms of reducing emissions, but they also have an impact in terms of creating jobs. All of that's been measured, it's been published, everybody knows about it. What is urgent is anticipation. It's about thinking ahead, planning, and especially financial planning. The first step, I'm not saying it's easy, but it's happening now. In other words, we've got seed funding. In France, there's a huge movement based on seed funding in this country and at European level. But we need to scale things up. We need to scale things up. This needs to be supported. And the third point concerns the protection of industrial property and the fact that in our country we've got standards. We can't you know, go back to artificial intelligence and cloud battles. We train great engineers who are very well versed in all of these subjects, and they have to be protected. And that's the real subject. That's what's urgent. We've got to implement planning. Thank you very much. I'm now going to hand the floor to Mr. Yongding, who is an economist at the Academy of Social Sciences in Peking. Normally he is connected. Yes, can you hear us? Yes, hello, Yongding. Can you hear us? It's a pleasure to see you again. Unfortunately, you're not with us. So you have the floor for 5 minutes.
I would like to utilize this opportunity to share some of Tijane's experience in industrial policy. Industrial policy was very fashionable in 1980s and 1990s in China. On the one hand, China wished to participate deeply into international division of labor, FDI, and trade to allow comparative advantage to have a full play. On the other hand, China wished to establish a comprehensive industry, which includes all vital sectors in the modern economy and can guarantee China's independence and security. To achieve the objective, the focus of China's industrial policy in 80s and 90s was to attract FDI and promote localization of parts and components of final products to achieve a sort of import substitution. The involvement of China's car industry is a case in point. In 2000, industrial policy became a controversial topic. The mainstream thinking was quite negative about industrial policy. Many argued that industrial policy created market distortion and a waste of resources and should be abandoned. In the middle of the 2000s, because Chinese entrepreneurs increasingly felt that their foreign partners are reluctant to transfer technology to them, and China was in danger of being locked in the lower ladder of international division of labor. As a result, the concept of indigenous innovation and creation became fashionable. And later, the plan of Made in China 2025 was introduced by a group of entrepreneurs, industrialists, and technocrats at the Ministry of Industry and Information. To be honest, at the time, few, if any, has paid great attention to this plan. I was a member of the advisory committee of national planning and participated in the discussion of Made in China 2025 during a regular session of the committee. Very soon, I forgot the existence of the plan until the Trump administration made a great fuss about it. Trade war and the events that was unfolding later, such as sanctions against ZTC, the arrest of Madam Meng Wanzhou, and the blacklisting of hundreds of Chinese tech firms by U.S. government made public in China, reached a consensus that China needs industrial policy, period. The only question is, what kind of industrial policy does China need? For a long time, Vice Premier Liu He emphasized the difference between horizontal industrial policy and selective industrial policy. He was in favor of horizontal industrial policy, but industrial policy has become quite selective recently in China. The targets of industrial policy are mostly aimed at specific products. For example, as target, the government has selected 16 projects, such as jumbo jets, semiconductor integrated circuits, electric cars, and so on. But horizontal industrial policy is still important in China. Experience shows that to identify the right target is not that easy. How to strike a balance between horizontal and selected industrial policies is still a problem, needs to be solved. China's industrial policy instruments include government procurement, product standards, localization requirements, product subsidies, tax incentive, investment promotion agencies, special economic zones, incubator program, and so on. But two stand out: direct subsidies to firms and below market credit to some enterprises, not necessarily COEs. Although at this moment, industrial policy is no longer a controversial issue in China, how to formulate and implement an industrial policy is still a huge challenge. There are two contradictions stand out. First, how to reconcile the conflicts between security and efficiency. In other words, on the one hand, China wishes to continue to participate in global supply chains. On the other hand, China also needs to minimize the negative impact of interruption of global supply chains due to various causes, including geopolitical causes. Second, how to encourage local governments continue to play the vital role in implementing industry policy in terms of a selection of projects in line with the central government's guideline and raise money to finance the projects while avoiding excessive competition and waste resources. The list of challenges on how to formulate and implement industrial policy is long, but let me stop here. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Merci. Je donne la parole.
I will now give the floor to Mr. Chelbi, former Minister of Industry in Tunisia and currently a banker. Sorry, I cannot hear you. Thank you, Mrs. Chairperson. So following the COVID and the Ukraine war, European countries tried to reinforce their technological sovereignty, and especially by reshoring their industry, which concerns first Europe, of course, but possibly the proximity circle or the first circle. So question, what is the scope of this action? In the last Davos meeting in May, we talked about friendly shoring, that is to relocate in friendly territories to ensure safe supply. And its report 2022, the Foundation Prospective and Innovation talked about solidarity innovation. Each country should find a mix of sovereignty and cooperation. This integral sovereignty or autarky does not exist. So the report mentions the example of Tunisia by mentioning that the paracetamol produced in Tunisia is the same as the one produced in Asia. Now, just a couple of figures. Maghreb Industries exported in 2021 30 billion euros into the European Union, outside of the energy. This is quite a low figure because Chinese exports were like 10 times higher, 500 billion euros. But bear in mind that the 30 billion export from Maghreb generates about 300,000 jobs in Maghreb in terms of partnership, and will ensure long-lasting jobs in Europe as well. So we can say that one job created in the Maghreb will ensure the durability of one job in Europe, and I will give you examples later on. Now, you can object that all this is a lovely discourse that we in Maghreb have always been heralding, but the reality is that this rationale for partial proximity relocalization or re-offshoring is boasted by political and employment personalities in Europe. But with the increase of price in the former East European country, now today, trend has to be accelerated, a trend which was initiated several years ago to make it the European sort of back office. If only 10% of Chinese export to Europe, that is basically 10%, that is 50 billion euros, were relocated, it will be about the double of the Maghreb export into Europe. So therefore, it is quite a challenge. Bearing in mind that the Maghreb region as a autonomous partnership option as a spirit of Asia into Europe, and therefore these two types of partnerships are not conflictual. So it is the durability of the entire Euromed production system which is here at stake. Either Europe can counterbalance China and the US by widening its scope of proximity cooperation, or Europe will continue to lose its industrial fabric and its sovereignty. So what would be the role of the states in that process? What could be the role of states in? Well, countries in the north, states in the north and the south have to define industrial policies and cooperation that can meet the expectation of industries from the two shores, especially since these industrial policies are not necessarily rejected by those who wanted a factory-free economy or who thought there would be a post-industrial future that everybody seems to have forgotten now. When all this has been said, so Keynes already mentioned that the failure of the invisible hand of the market should be corrected by the visible hand of the state. Jean-Paul Fitoussi, who was Tunisian actually, who passed away this year, said that laissez-faire is a theoretical folly which is applied nowhere in the world as an economic policy. So let me say that the law of the market are indicators that we should not stray away from, or unless there will be a high distortion, and we must have ambitious industrial policies with the learnings from the past mistakes and the recognition of the role of the markets or their failures. Jacques de Band used to say, there is no industry without the positive discrimination measures to forward this factor, otherwise the opters will opt for importation. If we are to keep one measure for economic policy, that would be the one. Thank you. I will now give the floor to Barry LYNN, Executive Director of Open Market Institute. Thank you.
Pour 5 minutes.
Thank you all. It's a great honor to be on this panel with this very distinguished set of people. And I apologize that I will speak in English. But it's either that or Spanish. So I'm going to start with a question. This is an industrial policy question. And it is, what is your plan? What's the plan of France? What's the plan of Europe when China invades Taiwan? And I will guarantee that you actually don't have a plan. And the United States also does not have a plan. And why is this? Is this warmongering? I think that given what's happened in the Ukraine, the idea that China may invade Taiwan is actually a reasonable question to ask now. And in fact, there's a lot of rumors coming out of my friends in the New York Times, among others, that there is a plan afoot for China to invade Taiwan. So what would happen if China invades Taiwan industrially? What would happen is pretty much every industrial system on which we depend in France, in Europe, in the United States, across Africa, across South America, all of these systems would come to a halt. They would shut down. They would stop because of the break in the flow of industrial goods, chemicals, electronics mainly. It would stop. That would be an industrial crash, unlike anything we've seen before. It would be a financial crash. You stop the flow of goods, you stop the flow of money. Industrial crash, financial crash. The day China moves on Taiwan, things come to a stop. So, now this is not the only threat that we face. Let's be clear. This is not something that is, China is not the only problem. I mean, we can imagine pandemics, we can imagine earthquakes, we can imagine many other events that actually create much bigger, events, disruptions that are just as large. Already, let's just be clear also, China's not necessarily the aggressor here. That's not what I'm saying. You could say Trump is the aggressor. One could say that Trump's attack on Huawei using a supply chain war was the first act in the coming war. So my first point today is that the status quo is unsustainable. It is unacceptable. It creates an unacceptable amount of risk. There is no way that we as rational actors can sit here and allow this situation to remain. A war on China on Taiwan or many other events could stop the industrial system tomorrow. So my second point is that we actually know what to do about this. It's pretty easy. We distribute industrial capacity. Why would a war between China and Taiwan or any of these other events create such amazing disruptions? It's because there's so much concentration in capacity. 20 years ago, industrial capacity was spread all across the world. There were multiple factories to make every single thing that we needed. Now, in many cases, there's a single factory or a single industrial zone that makes everything that we depend on. Chemicals, electronics, we can go down the list. There was a revolution that was affected over the last 20, 25, 30 years. It was affected by the capitalists following the rules established by the neoliberal revolution of the 1980s and 1990s. That neoliberal revolution unleashed monopoly capitalism, and we've seen massive concentration. So we know what to do, and what we need to do is use competition policy, including trade policy, to distribute the capacity on which we rely. My third point is that we can start doing this now. We can start doing this in ways that have a transformative effect beginning in the next 2 years. We have all the knowledge that we need. We have all the technologies that we need. And we can do this in a way that actually promotes a more open and resilient system, that recreates an international system that actually works for all people, including in Africa and across Asia and across South America, not just for our friends, not just for democracies. We can do this in a way that keeps China in the system. We don't have to exclude China. China is not the aggressor. In many ways, the United States has been the aggressor. We can do this in ways that create freedom for the investors. And we can do this in ways that actually allow us to create the rules that allow us to start to begin to deal with the tech problem, Google, Facebook, and Amazon. Okay. And the last thing I'll say, this is my conclusion, is that the two countries that should be leading this effort are France and the United States in the next 2 years. This is how we do it.
Merci beaucoup. Merci beaucoup. Alors nous avons...
Thank you very much. We got a couple of minutes to open a discussion together about all those points and the proposals made. I would like first to talk to Mr. Patrice MOROT. You talked about the studies carried out, made on the studies. What are the proposals, the solutions that would result from the studies you mentioned earlier on? Well, if we want to talk, and what Barry said, if we want to talk about reindustrialization, lasting reindustrialization, this effort, massive effort that has been initiated, if we want this to yield fruit, and then we would end up with more industries, reduction of the trade deficit. Let's face it, maybe we'll have to, it will be balanced or zero. Well, three priorities are necessary, which I would like to mention. First is training and education. Clearly, we need a massive training to relocate high schools, technical schools in territories. They should be located in the territories versus the needs, vis-à-vis the needs. You know, there is low mobility, and we realize often the trainings or educations are not matching the needs of the territories. And also, we should involve all the businesses. Often we hear about this term, which is the full CSR company, corporation, but you know, it is for us to conduct this. It's not just the state alone. We, the business, have to do this, to train, retrain, you know, long life learning with our teams. It's, you know, continuous long life learning to get the proper skills. We need a second priority axis. We need industrial coalitions at the European level. Don't think that we can have a French leader alone, especially that would be counterproductive because others will want to emerge as well. You know, in hydrogen or electronic components and others, we need coalition, European coalitions. And let's mobilize the savings of the French. 5,000 billion savings in France. Let's create a new, you know, we could, you know, which is a non-risky asset or with low-risk assets, you know, we could have a new saving book, you know, to achieve this ambition. That's my vision. Now we can see in the discussion that the geopolitics takes a new scope, and the relationship with our partners in the world have evolved. Now, I'd like to ask the first question in this domain to Mr. Garcia. How do you see the evolution of relationship between France and its European partners? Well, they're closely linked because there are political and regulatory frameworks which are homogeneous and matching, so there will be, and it will be more so. But we need to define the proper objectives and move rapidly in short term, you know, jobs, carbon control, you know, strategic positioning with the clean techs and so on and so forth. Those are elements that are ahead of us, and we must move on fast. And when to react to what Patrice said, we must trust the French working bees that will, which will go to flowers and lead to innovation. So, you know, we've got innovation by Dassault Systems, Schneider, Capgemini, Sopra, Steria, but those players do invest. They create all the jobs. This year, we in France, we were going to create 9,000 jobs, you know, including 3,000 in smart industry. That's pushing the lines, you know, shifting the lines. I mean, I'm giving you French figures, but this will contribute to the advent and the acceleration of French European players. So there is the regulatory political agenda that is being organized, and then the action of the ecosystems and the small and the big ones. Thank you. As I was saying earlier on, when they were talking about industrial sovereignty, we could think that the most relevant perimeter would be France first, Europe second, but there is also the rest of the world. Now, I'm putting the question to Mr. Gerbi after the proposal. Could you give us a successful example of this cooperation between Europe and Maghreb, for example? During the COVID, several assembly lines in Europe, automotive assembly line in Europe, were able to compensate the lack of delivery from China with the production from Tunisia of Bahia, or textile factories in Tunisia modified their production line to supply masks in Europe during the COVID crisis. But examples are quite numerous of European companies which saved their factories in Europe, which were threatened thanks to cost perequation, which provide a global competitiveness between the two sides in the north and the south. Just for indication, 142 companies manufacture automotive components in Tunisia for Europe, and 81 companies which manufacture air industry component. The leader in cable bundle in the world is a Tunisian company which has 20% of the market. Just to give you another example, Tunisian company of filters for the automotive industry bought a company in Paris, which was a problem. The jobs were doubled in France 10 years later, thanks to the distribution of references. The less labor-intensive SKUs are now made in France. And finally, in the 4.0 industry, which is today a reality in Tunisia, several companies operate there, including a large French group specialized in smart networks, Internet of Things. And don't forget the energy domain, which is a very major cooperation framework, be it fossil energies with the Transmed gas pipeline between Algeria and Europe, and which is quite significant today, be it for renewable energies, also in renewable energy. Well, we should launch new projects like the Midterm Sun Power Plant. Now, I would like to mention my friend Eli Cohen, who used to say that we'd be tempted to welcome a industrial sovereignty strategy with one expression: at last, trouble begins. Though, good luck to all you all. We're somewhat running out of time, but I will mix the answers with the rooms and the talks of the speakers. A question maybe I will ask to Yongding. Can you hear me? So, the question of the room is as follows. How could we find a balance? Could we envisage sovereignty, industrial sovereignty of developed countries to the detriment of the most fragile zone in a more trivial way? How to convince Chinese to buy Bordeaux wine and luxury handbags while reducing our trade? Can you tell us how we can convince Chinese people there? Did you get that, sir? Did you hear me? Did you hear the translation? Nope. Sorry, lost again. Someone could answer that? Oh, hello.
Yes. Sorry.
Oui, est-ce que la question...
Now, the question is, we want to reduce exchange with China, but China should keep buying our luxury goods. How can we do this? What do you say about that?
I think there should be no problem for China to buy in a very large quantity of products produced by European countries and by United States. Okay, I think it's very important for all countries to try their best to protect the global supply chain. I think that's very important. Even though China now is emphasizing importance of domestic demand, but China still pays great attention to the preservance of a global supply chain. So there's no policy change whatsoever. But here, I'd like to mention one thing, because Mr. Lin mentioned Taiwan. He said that China made Taiwan, attacked Taiwan. I think I should suggest him to read the Constitution still used by Taiwanese. To the Constitution, there's only one China. Taiwan is part of China. Mainland China is part of China. Okay, these two parts belong to one China. That's very important. There's no question about China invade Taiwan, attack Taiwan. People on the streets will solve their problem in a very amicable way. I believe that, because we have family members in Taiwan, and also there are lots of Taiwanese. They have relatives in mainland China. So I hope Ms. Lin will concentrate on how to protect global supply chain, worry less about so-called Chinese attack against Taiwan.
Merci.
Thank you.
Merci. Peut-être une dernière question.
Maybe one last question asked by the room. What are the costs of industrial sovereignty and France and Europe? Are France and Europe ready to accept such a cost? Who wants to jump on that one? The cost of industrial sovereignty. Mr. Well, it's complicated. It's not in terms of cost. Well, we should reason in terms of investment and jobs. And to be honest about the impact and the content of jobs, you know, about circularity, about the technology package for tomorrow. The cost vis-à-vis what the previous periods cost us, you know, in terms of jobs. I mean, you know, we can see today the billions that are invested in clean techs and which feed those seeding funds. It's more an issue of strategy and execution than cost, as we are talking now. So there is also a question now: how can we make sure that the company will do innovation and develop innovative industries in France? Well, they have to survive and develop. We were in startup in the suburb of Aix-en-Provence and Grenoble in 1967. You know, it's a company that took its fate in destiny in hand, you know, in terms of innovation investment. I think what we expect from the state in Europe is a framework, a strategic framework that will give us coherence in what we do to create jobs and contribute to the net zero future. Thank you. Mr. Lin, I give you 1 minute to conclude, if you wish to add something to what's been said.
You know, I started off with a pretty harsh view of what is in our future. But there's an alternative, and the alternative is to face up to the magnitude of the threats that we face because of the industrial system that has been built over the last 25 years according to the rules of the monopolists. The rules of the monopolists have led to a system that is fragile and subject to catastrophic failure. It's a system that is run largely, if not entirely, on carbon. And it is a system that is breaking down in many ways before our eyes right now. we can, if we face this, rebuild a system right beginning today that allows us to achieve all of our fundamental political and economic goals. We have that capability. We have to recognize the problem honestly and do what is necessary, and we will build a world that's worth imagining today.
Merci beaucoup. Merci à Monsieur Yongding et Monsieur.
Thank you, Mr. Yongding and Mr. Tidjane THIAM. Thank you all. Thank you all, and bye-bye.
Bonne continuation.